Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you again to my channel. Today we'll be looking at a very critical aspect based on some of the requests I've been getting from people as regards how do they attempt vulnerability management engineer type of interviews, how do they ascertain that they're going to get a job and all of that. So I actually created this video to um, provide my contribution in that space so that you can adequately prepare for your next interview and some of the questions that you might find and how you can also actually answer those questions. I also want to put a disclaimer out there that these questions are not necessarily what you might find 100% in your next interview. So you might be going for an interview tomorrow or next week, and it doesn't mean that all of these questions would be what you will find in your interview, because each job roles have specific job requirements and all that job objectives. So it's very important that we start with that so that you don't have too much of our expectations. But what you will learn in this particular video should put you in the right frame of mind and how you can actually attempt and come out successful if you're applying for vulnerability management role. All right. Okay, so let's start. Number one tip that I like to always give people, or that I always make use of when I'm happen to face or attempt any interview for any job, or especially for vulnerability management role, is that research about the company. And I can't overemphasize um, researching on the company you're trying to apply for. And what I've noticed is that one of the things that make people fail is that so many people sometimes don't do adequate research on the company that they're applying for, or the company that has requested for an interview with them. And one of the things that you should research for, number one, research about what, sorry, research about what the company is all about. Research about what what they do. Okay. So most times it's always important you know what the company does so that you can know how you can align your skill set to the organization. So you might want to know how many staffs they have, how long have they been in the industry, what is their organization, how far in terms of revenue, how much are they making, how do they treat their staff. You might also go to their YouTube channel, okay, if they have one, and then get as many information as possible. Know about what they do, know about their past successes, know about the awards that they've won in the past. And one of the reasons why you're doing this is because it's going to help you articulate yourself properly and also pitch your skill set as regards how you're going to contribute to the organization. And if the employer can actually sense that, oh, this person is going to bring a lot of value to the organization by the your tone of voice, the way you speak about the organization, the way you're passionate about the organization, that will put you a step ahead of other people. And also remember that when you're applying for any specific role, irrespective of the role you're applying for, remember that you're competing with people all around the world. So you should always ensure that you're not the only person that is being interviewed for this role, and then you should always put your best foot forward. Do as many research you could do, get as many information about the company, and when you start to speak, or when they start asking you questions, or they say tell us about yourself, which you're still going to get into, you have enough tool, enough information that you can use to back up probably why do you want to join this organization. You'll be able to say, oh, looking at the fact that your company made $1 million last year, and looking at some of the clients you deal with, then you bring it down to your own skill set. Oh, because I have such and such skill set, I'll be able to add value to your organization in such and such capacity and all of that. So I can't overemphasize researching about the company. This is very, very critical. Okay. Um, Sorry. So the next tip is read the job description of the role you are applying for. And one of the things I've also seen is that people are so excited, when they get an email, oh, you've been interviewed, you've been invited for an interview, and you get so excited that you usually or you neglect the job description of the role you're applying for. I would say that 90% of the questions you would find in the interview the interview you'll be facing is that most of the questions is going to come from the job objective. I have seen that in most of the interviews I've gone for, especially when it has to do with vulnerability management. all of those questions, 90% of them would actually come from the job objective. So it's very important that you read it properly, look at the gaps that you might have. Probably there's some skill set that you don't have that's on your resume that you definitely have to read up, ensure that you've had enough understanding about that particular job or that particular objective that you will be doing if per adventure you're selected for the role. So that this is also very very important. Okay, so let's move to the actual questions. So most questions or most interviews usually start with tell us about yourself. And from my experience and from what I've done is that I realized that what the interviewer is actually asking of you is not just about your name, where you've worked for before. What they're actually seeking to find is that in terms of the role you're applying for, can you tell us what you've done or the experience you have that would speak a lot to this role you're applying for? So, for example, you might say, "Oh, my name is A, B, and C. I've worked in company A, B, and C. For the past 55 years, I've been in vulnerability management. I've deployed the tool in different organizations. I've deployed it in an enterprise organization, in a small to medium organization. I've ensured that I oversee the processes involved in vulnerability management, down from asset management to reporting to validating the vulnerabilities. I've also ensured that I oversee the day-to-day remediation of vulnerabilities, ensuring that vulnerabilities have been remediated and they are being properly tracked, and properly reported to the appropriate stakeholders." So you tend to do a lot of speaking around what you've done as regards vulnerability generally, vulnerability management generally. So you could talk about the tools you've used. I've used Tenable, I've used Qualys, I've used Rapid7, I've used OpenVAS. So talk about all of those tools. Talk about some of the things that you find interesting about some of the tools. So if by adventure that role is for, let's say, for a Tenable specialist, for example, then you talk about how the numerous amount of tools you've been exposed to that Tenable provides. So you've used Nessus Essential, you've used Tenable SC, you've used Tenable IO, and all of that. So you tend to do a lot of speaking, into that particular role. If you've had some programming experience, you could talk about it as well. You could talk about how you've integrated vulnerability management tool with asset management tool, or with some ticketing management tool, or with service delivery management tool like ServiceNow, how you've worked in the cloud environment, how you've worked in on-premise environment. So all of this detail about yourself begins to give that your interviewer a lot of perspective. Okay, I think this guy is very experienced and is very vast. So sometimes the beauty of, and most times they might not really stop you when they ask you to tell us about yourself. So you have to be very objective. Okay, when you want to speak about yourself, ensure that everything you're saying is targeted towards the role you're applying for and the skill set you have, the value you're going to add to the organization, should in case they decide to go ahead with you to the next stage. Okay, so that this is very very, and what will help you in this particular answering this question effectively is because you've done your research and then you've read the job objective. So it allows you to put up together an adequate information about yourself, and then you can tailor it towards the role you're actually applying for. Okay, excuse me. So another question I've seen a lot is about what's the difference between TLS and SSL. And I tend to find this question a lot because it's a very, very tricky question, especially looking at the fact that what TLS is and what SSL is, and knowing fully well that a lot of people tend to mix it up. They usually call SSL TLS. They feel they are the same, but actually they are not. They are not the same. Okay, and then in the bit of you trying to answer question, I will also recommend that you try to go a little bit not too deep, especially if it's an area that you're not strong at, but ensure that you go a little bit beyond just answering the basic questions. Do a little bit of explanation about what the question is, or what they're actually asking for. So let's look into this question. So now the interviewer is asking, what is the difference between TLS and SSL? The first thing you need to know is that TLS means transport layer security. Okay, that's the first thing you need to mention. Then SSL equals to secure socket layer. Okay, now these are protocols. Okay, they are protocols that are used to ensure that data are not sent in plain text over the internet between a client, which is a web browser most of the time, and a web server. Okay, so these are the basic things you must actually mention when you're communicating about um, when you're having that conversation, because what you're trying to do, what the reason why you have that is because you have your HTTP. You're trying to send traffic across the internet, and then you want to ensure that that traffic is actually protected. Okay, which is what we call encryption. Okay, you're doing encryption and you're also performing confidentiality in securing information, in securing data. Okay, so the first thing you're also looking at is confidentiality. It helps to provide confidentiality. Okay, and so it tends to provide integrity as well. Okay, so across data once they're sent across the internet. Another thing to also pay attention to, so now I've not really gone deeper into the difference majorly, but I'm just trying to give an overview. Another thing you also need to mention is that you need to mention that the state of data. Okay, state of data. So data happens to be in three states. Number one, at rest. Number two, in transit. And number three, in use. Okay, so these SSL and TLS happen to ensure that data is being protected when in transit. And one of the things about both of them is that, so another thing to also note is that SSL is outdated. Okay, in the sense that it's outdated, it's less secure as compared to TLS, and if it's of different version. There's version 1, there's version 2, and there's version 3. All of these versions have been depreciated. So if you're running assessment, the web applications assessment, or you're running certificate based of assessment, you will realize that if you're still running any of these versions, then these versions are actually depreciated. So you find vulnerabilities that says you're running version 1 to SSL. Okay, SSL versions 1, 2, and 3, and all of these versions, they're all depreciated. Okay, so that's another thing to also note about both of them. And then for TLS, TLS is more secure, like I've said, and then it helps to prevent eavesdropping. Okay, so peradventure an attacker is trying to perform a man in the middle type of attack, TLS tend to prevent that type of attack. And then TLS also has different versions. TLS has version 1.0, version 1.1, version 1.2, and version 1.3. The latest version there is version 1.3. So if any app, so it depends. Some legacy application might be running version 1.0. So you might also ensure that your browser is compatible with using any of these versions. But the current version is version 1.3. The other thing again to also notice that they tend to use two types of encryption types, which is symmetric, okay, and asymmetric. Okay, for symmetric means that you use the same key, one key, to encrypt and also decrypt. Okay, you use the same key to encrypt and decrypt. While for asymmetric, you use one key, which is the private. You use private and public key. Okay, so you can either use any of the keys to encrypt or decrypt, but most of the time you use private keys. You use public keys to encrypt. Okay, because your partner or the person you're sending the key will always have your public key. So you can use the public key to encrypt, and then they use their private key to decrypt. Okay, so all of this information that I've mentioned, it provides an additional context. And when you're speaking, the interviewer knows that, okay, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Okay, so most of the time, you just want to know that does this person know, is because sometimes they might just ask you literally, is TLS the same as SSL? Okay, and then you can now start bringing out some of your points and saying, no, they're different. TLS is an advanced version of SSL and all of that, so you can provide a lot of those information. So another thing I also want to say is that each of these questions I'm going through, I would also like for you to do your further research. do much more in-depth research so that you can gather much of details that you can also put into should in case you find this question. Okay. um, Next question. The next question is that explain the vulnerability scanning process. And now, yeah, this question is another very, very tricky type of question, in the sense that it tends to see if you have a proper understanding of the vulnerability management process. And then, and this is very critical. I always say this, that if you want to be a good vulnerability management engineer, you've got to understand the vulnerability management process. It is very, very critical. I mean, if you understand the process very well, there's no question or there's no tool you won't be able to manage or handle. Fine, you might definitely have to learn the technology of the vendor, but in terms of doing the overall work, running assessment, providing report, it's basically the same. All tools make use of this process. Okay, so let me go into the process, just to give a little bit of a reminder. I did a video on that, but I just want to do a little bit of explanation about that. So first thing is that you identify assets. Okay. Number two, you prioritize your assets. Pardon me if my handwriting is not so it's not so beautiful. The third thing is to assess. Okay. This is when you run your assessment. Okay. The fourth thing is when you do your report. And number five is you remediate or patch. And number six is you validate the vulnerability that has been patched. Okay. So now let's go back to the actual question itself. So the interviewer is saying that explain the vulnerability management process. The first thing you have to mention is that you have to look at identifying assets. So you can't run a vulnerability assessment if you don't know the asset you're trying to assess. You're trying to run your assessment on. So it's very critical that you go about understanding that they've got to first be an asset, or there's going to be a connectivity or a reachability from the vulnerability management tool that you're trying to use to run an assessment in connecting with the asset itself. So most time, first thing you always do is to run a host discovery. Okay, host discovery. Okay, so this host discovery cuts across different tools. Different tools uses different approach to achieve it. But there's got to be a way whereby you ensure that your vulnerability assessment tool can reach the host you're trying to target. So your host discovery allows you to ensure that that's possible. So it uses an ICMP ping to ensure that there's a ping between your vulnerability management tool and then the target that you're trying to scan. Okay, and then different tools use different approaches. So the next thing is to do the next thing after you've been sure that you've been able to identify or there's a reachability between your assessment tool and the target is to run profiles, scanning profiles. Okay, so these scanning profiles happen to be templates. Okay, so you use template or scanning profile. So different tool, like I said, also call it different names. So for Tenable, it could be a basic networking scan template. For Tenable callers, it might be you want to run they call it scanning profile. So you choose a profile based on the type of assessment you want to run. Okay, and once you run that, the next thing is to include your parameters. Okay, so in this sense, this is where you get your subnets or the IP addresses that you want to scan, and then you begin to input the parameters. If you're not using the default setting, you want to tweak the default setting to suit depending on the type of assessment you're running. Then you include the parameters, and then you tweak the parameters, the default parameters, whatever um, uh, information you definitely require for you to be able to run an assessment effectively. Another type of thing again you might also want to speak to is the scanning type. Okay, so this is where we have authenticated scans, and then we have non-authenticated scans. Okay, so in this phase, what you're trying to do is you're trying to ensure that you're running authenticated scans. And authenticated scans, it's actually always the best practice because it allows you to gather more information as regards the vulnerabilities existing on that particular target. Because running using authenticated scans provides your assessment tool a local administrative access, to be able to reach the target and then scan in depth so that you can get much more vulnerabilities and all of that. Okay, so once you've done that, then we look at reporting. Okay, you provide a report, be it in CSV format or in PDF format, and then you share the report. You share the report with executives, okay, and also technical teams. Okay, and then once you've shared the report, then you begin to remediate those vulnerabilities. Okay, and then you validate if those vulnerabilities have actually been fixed. So you understanding the process of vulnerability management would allow you to be able to answer any question that has to do with scanning effectively. Running explain the vulnerability scanning process and all of that. So it's important that you understand that. And the reason why I had to go through that bit by bit explanation is because I just wanted you to have that context as to how to answer this kind of a question. So now I'm not, if you notice, I'm not providing you say A, B, C, D. I'm not giving you a verbatim answer. I'm just trying to expand your mind and give you as much information should in case you find this type of question in your interview, and then you can speak to it, like an authority, like, that you intend to be. Okay, let's move to the next question. Okay, so the next question is, how do you run scans so it doesn't disrupt services? Now, this question is another very important and valuable question, because what the interviewer is looking at is that how do you manage, should in case, how do you, what's your process behind running scans? Are you just interested, oh, I just want to run my scan anytime I feel like, when you're not particular, or you're not concerned about the services running on the target machines that you're trying to run your assessment on. So the first thing you should look at here when you're speaking, number one, you need to look at scanning frequencies, okay? And what this means is how many number of times should you scan, and and also when you're looking at scanning frequencies, you also need to look at the scanning periods. Meaning, are you going to run it during off peak period or during peak period? Okay. So in my experience, most of the organizations I've worked with would decide, okay, based on the sensitivity of our servers, we want you to run scans only on weekends. So in this type of environment, you also need to know that. So if, for example, you're running an assessment on on endpoint, for example, on client machines, if it's an organization whereby you're running, let's say you're doing an agent-based type of scanning, uh, once the users are not in the office, okay, probably weekends, you can't run your scans because they will be offline, or probably they will have shut down their systems and all of that. So in this kind of scenario, you actually want to run the scans maybe very early in the morning, maybe by 9 a.m. or something. So it all depends on the peculiarity of the organization. But the idea here is that whenever you're running your scan, you should run your scan at the period whereby it's not going to disrupt service. Also, looking at the type of device you're scanning. So if you're scanning a legacy device, for example, some of these legacy devices, they are they are very, very finicky, in the sense that if they receive too much probe, some of them might shut down. Okay, and they might have very critical services running on them. So those type of devices, you might have to say, okay, we're going to be running devices on the weekends. The idea here is just to ensure that anytime you're running your services, it's off peak period. It's a period whereby services are not actively running, so that you don't disrupt services when you're running your assessment. Okay, so the idea is to ensure that your assessment are done at a period that is not off peak. So, and don't just say, oh, I'm just going to just want this kind of period. You have to create a little bit of story behind it, so that they know that, okay, this person really knows what he's doing and what he's saying. So you just don't answer the question verbatim and say, oh, I don't want the services. Want this. Ensure that you want the services or the assessment only when the system during off peak periods and all that. So don't just go verbatim like that. Put a story behind it, so that it shows that, okay, this person have a good understanding of what he or she is actually doing. Okay. So let's move to the next question. So the next question says, which scanning type is ideal for scanning an enterprise environment. Okay, so I did a video on scanning types, which has to do with authenticated scanning type and non-authenticated scanning type. I spoke about that in my previous video, but let me just do a recap here. So what this question is saying is that they're actually asking you for explain what the different scanning type are and give a recommendation which one do you think is appropriate for an enterprise environment. So in best practice is that when you're running your assessment, always run authenticated uh, type of scans, okay? Because it's going to go in depth and then it's going to provide you with more vulnerability with different higher severity levels. It's going to go more in depth and then you're going to have a huge amount of vulnerability that you might be omitting if you're running non-authenticated scans, okay? So here, what the interviewer is asking is that, okay, so in this process of answering this question, you're going to say, okay, so there are two types of scanning types, for example. There's authenticated scanning type and there's non-authenticated scanning type. For authenticated scanning type, it means that you have to run a scan using a local administrative account. You have to provide in a local administrative account within your assessment tool so that account will be used to scan across your enterprise, okay? And that, because it has a local administrative access, it will be able to run in-depth scans. So you're saying that with a authenticated scan, you will have much more value in terms of the vulnerabilities you're going to capture, the number of vulnerabilities you're going to capture, the severity levels of the vulnerabilities you're going to capture. So it's very important that you answer the question in that manner. Just ensure that when you're answering the question, try to put a story behind it, and then ensure that you speak to specific terms. You use specific terms like authenticated scan, non-authenticated scan. You look at peculiar environment, enterprise environment. So if they have an enterprise environment, so that means that definitely there's going to be a centralized identity management services like your Active Directory, and things like that. So you also have to mention things like that. So that also shows that you have a contextual information as regards to how an enterprise environment run, especially when it comes to running security assessment. Okay. So sorry about that. Okay, so this is another very important question: is that what is the difference between TCP and UDP type of scanning? So now this will also speak to your experience, how you've been able to manage different type of scans, and why is it important to run a TCP scan or UDP scan, depending on the kind of environment that you're working on. Okay. So first thing you got to know is that you've got to know the terminologies of what TCP is and what UDP is. Okay. So TCP means transmission control protocol. Okay. So equals to transmission control protocol. Okay, and the other one, UDP, is user datagram protocol. Okay, so these two different types of protocol, they operate at layer 4. Okay, in the OSI model. But when it comes to scanning, they might also operate at layer, depending on the port you're scanning though, we actually operate at layer 7, okay, which is the application layer. Okay, and the OSI model, this is the transport layer. Okay, so all of this type of information, when you start speaking and you say, okay, TCP and UDP scans, TCP actually means transmission control protocol and UDP means user datagram protocol, which of both of them at the network level, if they operate at the network layer, they operate at layer 4, which is the transport layer, especially if you're running network type of assessment. But if you're trying to run application level type of assessment, you're trying to run it against, let's say, HTTP or DNS, which uses UDP as well, or DHCP, which uses UDP as well. All of that happens to be at the layer 7 and layer of the OSI model. So when you start speaking like that, this guy knows what he's doing. Okay, so going into the scan itself, so TCP, excuse me, The TCP type of scan happens to be connection oriented type of scanning, and the UDP happens to be non-oriented connection, non-oriented, non-connection oriented type of scanning. So for TCP means that you have to follow the full TCP handshake, which is sync, this the flag sync, sync ACK, and then the ACK flag. Okay, so all of this needs to be in sync for a TCP type of scan. Although there are different types of TCP scan as well. There's a sync scan as well, which happens to just send the sync flag just to validate if the port or the services running on that particular target is actually open. And then TCP tends to be more faster, okay, in terms of transmission when it communicates with the target. UDP is quite slow, because it does not have any form of, it doesn't, it's not connection oriented, so it doesn't receive any major flags. It only receives the flag that if a particular port is open, let's say DHCP port for example is actually open, so it will receive a particular flag to notify that okay, that particular port is open. So these are some of the examples, of differentiating between both of them. And then they tend to provide different types of responses, especially when you're running, let's say you're using Nmap to run those assessments. You tend to see open if the port is open, you tend to see closed if the port is closed, you tend to see filtered, okay, and then sometimes you tend to see tampered, okay. So all of these type of states of your ports provide you with that type of information, okay. So it's very critical that you have all of these details, and then you tend to present that when you're having your interview questions, okay. So having this kind of details just shows that okay, this person is well versed and he knows what is actually doing, okay, in terms of responding to those questions. Okay, another question is how do you handle resistance to scan results? And before I go into this, so what I've also observed again is that the three angles that I've seen vulnerability management questions come out for. So they usually divide the question into three angles. Okay, so the first one, they ask you technical questions. Okay, so you prepare for as many technical questions as possible, looking at the job objective, also looking at some of the things that you know. You can also use, expect a lot of technical questions. Then number two, you need to also, prepare for vulnerability management specific questions. So it might be a tool that they might be asking you a question about that particular tool, wanting to know what is your experience level on that particular tool. And then the last question is about, client relationship. Okay, how do you relate with your stakeholders? So you tend to have questions, you know divided around these three sections. For recap, technical questions, then vulnerability management questions specifically targeted towards vulnerability management, and then they ask you questions that has to do with customer service. How do you communicate? How do you respond back to some resistance? How do you handle resistance? Okay, so let me just answer the question. So this type of question, how do you handle resistance to scan results? So I've seen, in my daily experience, I've seen a lot of time whereby you run a scan and then you send it to your stakeholders, and they tend to be resistant. They tend to provide a word that no, this is not correct, this is not actually correct. And then in this case, I usually tell people, or the way I usually respond first is that you don't have to um, be rude, because most of the time what you're actually looking out for here is everybody's on the same team, and then you're trying to ensure that the goal of the organization, which is to ensure that you manage the risk, is actually achieved. So you might have to go back and look at your scan configurations, okay, to ensure that you on your own side you've done the actual thing. So because sometimes, for example, you're running a scan, and then you're running a scan on a particular subnet, and that subnet, as in the client environment, they understand that we only have 6 live IP addresses, okay, and then your subnet is providing, the subnet that you scan is providing, let's say, 30 live IP addresses. Okay, so definitely there will be a resistance, in the sense that we know that in this particular subnet only 6 IP addresses are actually live. So where are you getting your 30 IP addresses from? So some of these type of discrepancies might come from probably the firewall configuration. Okay, remember that the scanning probe will have to go through the firewall depending on how the architecture of the organization is. Okay, so all of these things you would have to put them into consideration, but the idea here is to ensure that you provide an adequate communication. You're not you don't quarrel or try to fight back and try to call names that I know what I'm doing, those kind of fight backs and all. Just be polite, ensure that what you're doing is adequate, and then you provide a specific response, as the case may be. But I've seen questions like this, so they might want to put a scenario to it. Okay, and then this is where your uniqueness actually come into play, and then you answer as you best fit. But the critical thing here is to ensure that on your own part you've done your due diligence, you've ensured that you're using the correct scan parameters, you've considered the firewalls, you're ensuring that you're using the appropriate scanning technique. Probably you're using UDP scans or you're using TCP. Just ensure that on your own side you've done. But the key thing they're looking for here is how you communicate with your stakeholders. Okay, your interpersonal relationship is what they're actually looking out for here. Okay, and then the final question is describe the process of remediating identified vulnerabilities. Okay, so here you've gone through the process, you've run the scan, you've created a report. Now it's time to start tracking those vulnerabilities. And here, one of the things you have to put in place is to ensure that there's a tracking process, and you have a tracker, okay, to track the remediated vulnerabilities. So you might have vulnerabilities that have been remediated in the past 30 days, okay, and vulnerabilities that have not been remediated, so active vulnerabilities. Okay, so different tools actually provide you with different method for you to track your vulnerabilities. So probably you've extracted your CSV file, and then you've created a chart, and then you're using those charts to track identified vulnerabilities, and also the vulnerabilities that are still active, or vulnerabilities that are exploitable, or you're looking at vulnerabilities that has been in the environment for the past 30 days, or vulnerabilities that has been fixed in the past 30 days. So here, what they're actually paying attention to here is how do you track the vulnerabilities that have been remediated. So some might be using some service delivery type of tool integrated, the tracking tool integrated into your vulnerability management tool to track those vulnerabilities. So you might actually forward the vulnerability to a particular engineer, and once that engineer has resolved that vulnerability, they might actually close it. Okay, and then you can also ensure that you validate that those vulnerabilities that have been remediated. And then one of the things I've also seen in this aspect is that, okay, so we've remediated the vulnerabilities, we've run a validation, and we are still seeing that particular vulnerability when we run our scans. Okay, and sometimes this thing could be very frustrating because remediating vulnerabilities are endless. That is why there's a need for you to prioritize. Okay, prioritize those vulnerabilities. So it's very endless, this type of task, and it could be very stressful sometimes. You've spent a number of hours trying to remediate a particular vulnerability, and then you run the scan, and then you still finding the vulnerability. What I would recommend is, most times what I've seen in my experience as well, is that you tend to go check the registry, because sometimes if the registry, because especially if you're running authenticated scans, because it goes deeper into the configuration settings to look at registry to find the version that is running and all of that. So you might have to go to the registry and do a cleanup, okay, as pertaining to that particular application, for example. And then once you do that, if you run the scan, I'm so certain that you might not find a particular vulnerability again. So that it happens sometimes, it doesn't happen, okay, but that's the way. Those are some of the things that I've tend to see in my experience as regards when it comes to vulnerability management question. Okay, so this is my final tip, and then I wish you all the best as you attempt your next vulnerability engineer role. Like I said, take your time, do a little bit more research, to have more in-depth information. Perhaps there's something I didn't touch when I was asking those questions. You could have more detail. But remember, the key thing is that first thing is read about the organization you're trying to apply for. Ensure that you do your research effectively, and when it's time to speak about yourself, put as many information about what you've learned, your experience, the value you're trying to put to the organization, and then I believe that you do well. All right, thank you very much for viewing this video. I hope you find this very valuable, and then I'll see you in my next video. Bye for now.